Welcome. I'm coming to you from the kitchen today, as, after all, it is Women's History Month. You know what that means. It's my duty to cover a true girl boss from American herstory, someone who truly embodied the spirit of gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss. One Rebecca Latimer Felton. And that's about as much of this as I can take. Ah, that's better. Rebecca Ann Latimer was born in Decatur, Georgia on the 10th of June, 1835, to a Mrs. Eleanor Swift Latimer and Mr. Charles Latimer, both of which were descended from Chesapeake planters, with her father moving from Maryland to DeKalb County, Georgia, in the 1820s. DeKalb County borders Fulton County, in which Atlanta sits, giving the Latimer family relatively easy access to the capital, thus the levers of power. It was as a child living in northern Georgia that Rebecca witnessed some of the Cherokee as they embarked on what would become known as the Trail of Tears. In fact, when she was 3, this was one of her earliest memories. When interviewed later in life, she said, quote, "I have an indistinct recollection of seeing the red men as they went through the woods." At the age of 15, Rebecca was sent to live with relatives in Madison, where she attended the Madison Collegiate Institute, graduating in 1852 at the top of her class. Madison had only been established in 1849 and was not the first institute of its kind in Georgia. Actually, America's first female college that was established with the intention of being a female college was founded in Georgia. In fact, the first college to issue a bachelor's degree to a woman anywhere in the world was Georgia Female College, better known by its current name, Wesleyan. Speaking of Wesleyans, Rebecca would marry Dr. William Harrell Felton in October of 1853, at the age of 18. William, on the other hand, was 30, but well established. He was born on his family's plantation near Lexington, Georgia, in 1823. He received his undergraduate degree in 1843 from the University of Georgia's Franklin College, and the very next year he earned his medical degree from the Medical College of Georgia. People were really creative with names then. William celebrated his new medical practice by getting married to his first wife, Mary Ann Carleton, the daughter of a prominent merchant family in Athens. But don't worry about her. She was just a placeholder while we wait for Rebecca, who was in her first year of college at the time. That same year, William would be elected to the Georgia House of Representatives as a representative for Cass County and a Whig. All of that would prepare him for the beginning of the rest of his life, as in October of 1853, William Harrell Felton, the 30-year-old doctor, legislator, planter, and widower, would marry the 18-year-old college graduate formerly known as Rebecca Ann Latimer. Now, this may sound off-putting to some, but I'll remind you, she was 18 and a college graduate. Also, Georgia's age of consent at the time was 10. So, I mean, William's a gentleman. That is showing restraint at the time. Dr. William Felton was truly a gentleman who would grow to appreciate the benefits of marrying an educated woman. Rebecca would likewise enjoy the benefits of marrying a man of means, as upon their marriage, Rebecca Latimer Felton would move to Dr. Williams's plantation near Cartersville, which is northwest of Atlanta, one county away. Now, as mistress of the house, she was in charge of the house slaves. Point of note here, she technically never personally owned any slaves. She co-owned slaves with her husband. But I'm not really going to nitpick here. But that does let us check off one of the G's. Girl boss! As mentioned, Rebecca married William in October of 1853 and conceived that very night, giving birth to John Latimer Felton 9 months later on the 13th of July, 1854. 2 years later, Rebecca would give birth to her only daughter, Mary Ella Felton, who tragically would only live 16 months, dying October 17th, 1857. Also in 1857, William was ordained a Methodist minister. See, I told you the marriage would connect to Wesleyans. 1.5 years after the death of her second child, Rebecca had her third, William Harold Felton Jr., born May 26th, 1859. Despite being a slave owner in the lead up to the Civil War, the Feltons were not firebrand secessionists. In fact, secession wasn't that popular in the county. Of the 3 delegates Cass County sent to Georgia's secession convention, all 3 voted against secession. However, once the die was cast, plantation owners decided it would probably be beneficial to side with the nation that was being established specifically to protect their rights. When asked about this post-bellum, Rebecca explained, quote, "All I owned was invested in slaves." In fact, the entire county so enthusiastically welcomed secession that after Bull Run, they renamed themselves from Cass County to Bartow County in honor of Francis Bartow, who is a former Georgia congressman who died commanding the Oglethorpe Light Infantry in said battle. William, of course, offered his medical knowledge and served as a surgeon for the Confederate wounded recovering in Macon. While the doctor was out, Rebecca would run the plantation. This was a system that worked well until 1864, when, as mentioned previously, the Latimer plantation was to the northwest of Atlanta, which just so happened to be the direction that Sherman approached from in the Atlanta campaign. This led to the Latimer plantation being burnt to the ground. The hits kept coming as 2 weeks after the fall of Atlanta, Rebecca's third child became her second child to not reach adulthood, with William Harold Felton Jr. dying on September 17th, 1864, at the age of 5. Soon after war's end, Rebecca's firstborn would also pass on when, on June 27th, 1865, John Latimer Felton passed just 2 weeks shy of his 11th birthday, leaving Rebecca childless and homeless, but far from destitute. Her husband, no longer a plantation owner, still owned a large farm, and the Feltons were still on their feet. They were homeless but not destitute. They were able to rebuild relatively quickly. In fact, in early 1866, they opened the Felton Academy, as Rebecca in particular valued education, especially education for girls. This actually has roots, and in fact, Rebecca's education has roots in the ideals of Republican motherhood. That's small r Republican. And this has to do with education begins at home. As we are a Republican, it is our duty to keep it. Thus, with education beginning at home, it is a mother's duty to instruct her children to be good citizens. How can you have a future male voter be good and righteous and know how to support the Union if his mother doesn't teach him how to be proper? So thus, women, even if it took a bit for collegiate education to begin, must have a certain degree of education so that they can pass it on to their children. Despite her deep care for girls, Rebecca kept having boys, giving birth to Howard Irvin Felton on June 2nd, 1869, followed by Paul Felton 2.5 years later on January 3rd, 1872. Paul was her final child, and he died on September 2nd, 1873. For those of you keeping track, that's 5 children, 4 of which were boys, and 4 of which died in childhood, with the longest lived still not making it to his teens. In 1874, William ran for Congress, and in a very narrow election, he ousted the Bourbon Democrat, Pierce Manning Butler Young, who had served both as Major General in the Confederate Army and as the representative for Georgia's 7th District, serving 4 terms before being ousted. Now, you might have noticed I mentioned the term Bourbon Democrat. This has both to do with the Bourbon dynasty of France and Bourbon, Kentucky. I'm not going to go too much into it. However, I have mentioned a liquor, and you know the rules for this channel. Especially since it's Women's History Month, it's time to liquor. This election was brutal and close. Rebecca later called it, quote, the fiercest political battle ever known to the state at that time. It was so close that William won by less than 100 votes. 82 to be precise. And did I mention that Rebecca was his campaign manager? For this and all future elections. She didn't just manage things behind the scenes either. It was known that she managed his campaign. Not only did she manage his campaign, she wrote many of his speeches. In light of this, the Thomasville Times wrote, quote, we sincerely trust the example set by Mrs. Felton will not be followed by Southern ladies. This feeling was not universal, however, with those in favor of the partnership joking that they were blessed with 2 representatives instead of 1. In fact, Rebecca was dubbed the political she of Georgia, and her stature only grew over time. I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds with William's politics, except to say that despite running as a Democrat, because this was the South post-Civil War and he wanted to win, he did run afoul of the Bourbon Democratic establishment, resulting in him losing his 4th re-election bid in 1880, an election which had voting irregularities in 2 of the most populous counties in his district. William chose to simply accept the loss and return to his farm and his pastoral work for 4 years before deciding to run again. This time once again at a state level, returning to the Georgia House of Representatives after a 33-year hiatus, where he would serve until his retirement in 1890. Which means I can finally stop talking about William and return to Rebecca, who incidentally was becoming increasingly involved in politics in her own right around this time. In 1885, she founded a small newspaper, alongside writing a semi-weekly column in the Atlanta Journal, where she advocated for increasing public education, better employment opportunities for women, female suffrage, and prison reform, including the end of convict leasing. In 1886, Rebecca joined the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, and next year gave a speech at the movement's convention in which she advocated for women having more authority at home, along with, once again, stressing the importance of educating girls and stating her firm belief in more employment opportunities for women, as long as they were white. That brings us to the next G, gatekeep. I mean, come on, this is a former slave owner we're talking about. She isn't going to go from viewing blacks as property to viewing them as fellow citizens and equals. Now, this wasn't just racism. It was also pragmatic. She was engaging in realpolitik, if you will. I actually have a chart to explain this. Post 14th and more importantly 15th Amendment, voting in Georgia looked like this, with legally both white and black men allowed to vote. However, after 1877 and the corrupt bargain of same year, voting in reality looked much more like this. There were some exceptions. However, in general, it became pretty much just white men again, with some black men slipping through the cracks. Rebecca, however, believed the voter rolls should look more like this, with white men and white women voting. Yay her, she'd be included. And everything would be right in the world, in her mind. Now, the absolute worst case scenario to her would be this. Ew! Everyone can vote? Disgusting! As you can see in this scenario, the proportional power of her group is halved by the inclusion of non-whites. Meaning, even if she wasn't racist, she was, even if she wasn't racist, purely from a pragmatic standpoint, she would have a reason to, once acquiring the franchise, say, stop it there, don't add more people. In that instance, my vote is lessened the more voters there are. In theory, once again, this is an explanation, not an endorsement. All of this would lead her to believe that this was optimal. Remember, although in theory, this was the current state post 15th Amendment, this was more of the reality. So if you have this and find there's a sliver of black men who slip through the cracks, under no circumstances would she want full enfranchisement. After all, like I said, there's the practical aspect, but then there's also just the racism. I'm now going to go into several examples of said racism. When I mentioned she advocated against the prisoner lease system, that wasn't because she had a moral objection to prisoners being used as borderline slaves. Rather, it was because prisoners, a good number of which were black, being leased out meant that they weren't behind bars and thus had easier access to white women. Rebecca referred to black youths as half-civilized gorillas and claimed they had a brutal lust for white women. I did see one source saying there was a possibility that Rebecca was assaulted in the latter half of the war, or she at least witnessed some form of assault from recently freed men. If true, that's bad, but not something policy decisions should be based on. You shouldn't base on anecdotes when it comes to stripping people's freedoms. But that's neither here nor there. Now for the comically racist bit. When I said she advocated for public education, she wanted none of that funding to be for black people, because in her mind, if you educated a black man more, he would simply commit crimes in a smarter manner, thus get away with more crimes, meaning in her mind, the more money spent on educating them, the more criminal they would become. Okay. Next, when the 1893 Chicago World's Fair was being planned, Rebecca suggested a slavery was good, actually exhibit. This would have included, quote, a cabin and real colored folks making mats, shuck collars, and baskets, a woman to spin and card cotton, and another to play the banjo, and show the actual life of the slave, not the Uncle Tom sort. One moment, let me just... Hey! Girl boss trifecta achieved. This unfortunately ends the comically racist section and brings us back to the horrific racism section. In 1897 or 98, I've seen conflicting sources, Rebecca gave a speech to the Georgia State Agricultural Society in which she chastised white men for not supporting women, specifically not valuing rural women. This was the Agricultural Society, after all. She also rebuked them for not doing enough to stop assaults from black men. She then promoted the theory that in giving black men political power, this promoted them using physical power against white women. And that the obvious solution to deter this was lynching, stating, quote, as long as your politicians take the colored man into their embrace on election day, so long will lynching prevail. If it needs lynching to protect a woman's dearest possession from the ravening human beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary. This speech was spread and was eventually reprinted in the Weekly Star of Wilmington, North Carolina. Following this, the Daily Record, also of Wilmington, issued a rebuttal. Said Record was North Carolina's only black-owned newspaper and the only daily newspaper owned by a black man in the United States. The Daily Record was owned and operated by Alexander Manly, whose grandfather was Governor Charles Manly. In fact, both of Alexander's parents were mixed. However, at the time, that didn't really matter. One drop rule, he was black. A little bit more background to set the scene. Wilmington, being in coastal North Carolina, was thus not in the deep South. North Carolina was, in fact, the last state to join the Confederacy, and throughout the Civil War, other southern states questioned her commitment. When Sherman was marching north, once they came out of South Carolina, incidents of arson by federal troops dropped precipitously as North Carolina was not as gung-ho of secession, and in fact, there were some instances in western North Carolina where people kind of just deserted and hid in the hills because what are you going to do? Catch me in the Appalachians? Good luck. Now, Wilmington specifically was North Carolina's most populous city at the time, only being surpassed by Charleston in 1910. The city was also under a coalition government of the People's Party and the Republicans. And together they were known as the Fusionists. But without getting too deep into it, white resentment had been growing for a while and was especially excited when Manly dared suggest that some white women might actually consent to sleeping with black men. This all came to a head when on November 8th, 1898, the Democrats made a clean sweep in the local election. However, not every seat is up in every election, meaning Wilmington still had 3 black aldermen and a white Republican mayor. This didn't sit right with the mob, and over 1,500 white men on November 10th burned Alexander's newspaper office to the ground before marching to the municipal offices and forcing all Fusionists to resign, and instating men loyal to them. This, by the way, is the only successful coup attempt in American history. But the mob didn't stop there. By this point, they'd grown to 2,000 strong, and they began to simply terrorize black residents. killing dozens and causing over 2,000 to flee. By the end of hostilities, Wilmington was no longer majority black. This was emblematic of a shift statewide. Within a few years, blacks would essentially be re-disenfranchised. Manly, by the way, escaped, and Rebecca's response to him escaping was that he should have been lynched. Back to Georgia. Next year, 1899, saw the lynching of Sam Hose, who had been falsely accused of, it's YouTube, struggle snuggling a white woman. Rebecca also publicly endorsed this lynching. Now, remember, according to her, this was about supporting women, a mission she continued by joining the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1900. It is in her fight for women's rights that Rebecca is most positively remembered. Speaking of in memoriam, her husband would pass September 24th, 1909. She would keep his legacy alive, however, by continuing her fight, linking white women voting with lessening the power of black men voting. I'm going to go to the chart again real quick. So if you have to accept that black men will vote, just cut out black women. See this? If you have white women and white men, boom, coalition, beat them. Here, they team up, not good. Once again, this is not my opinion. This is Rebecca's logic. That way, boom, come on. If the blacks are going to be able to vote, at least have the white women so that there's still a majority, and it's not this where, like, they can choose who they want and they actually have a chance. No, you want us. So she's arguing to the other, she's arguing to the white men in power that actually it's best for you if women vote, as long as it's only the white women who vote. In 1914, when called to speak before the Georgia State Legislature, Rebecca argued, quote, "Why can't women help you make laws, same as they help you run your homes and churches?" A valid point. And a return to an earlier argument from Rebecca, who, although she did advocate for female employment and equal pay for equal work, she also saw women's contributions at home as enough to entitle them to representation. She would then go on to say, quote, "I do not want to see a Negro man walk to the polls and vote when I myself cannot." Remember the chart. She said this during a debate with the female anti-suffragettes Mildred Lewis Rutherford and Dorothy Blount Lamar, both of which deserve but will not be receiving their own videos. I, however, can't not talk about them briefly. Dorothy and Rebecca were actually both alumni of Wesleyan. Dorothy, however, then went on to Wellesley College, which is in Massachusetts. And given its location, she only agreed to attend after being assured that there would be no black students. Additionally, her arguments against the 19th Amendment were that it was essentially the 15th Amendment in another form, as after all, granting the franchise to all women included black women. Remember, even if not from racism, it was, but even if not, in a mere power politic point of view, the more franchise is bad. She far preferred the one house, one vote model and argued that that actually gave women more power, as wives can generally convince their husbands. She also supported the lost cause, but not as vociferously as Mildred Lewis Rutherford, who, in addition to her anti-suffrage work, was a lost cause historian, going so far as to argue that the southern states didn't really have slaves. These two women's efforts, however, were successful in Georgia, as despite the 19th Amendment being approved by the House and Senate, when it came time for the states to ratify it, Georgia demurred. Despite Georgia not approving said amendment, it still reached the necessary 3/4 of states ratifying it on August 18th, 1920, with the Tennessee House of Representatives voting to ratify it by a single vote. Incidentally, there's a story that the representative who, at the last minute, switched to a yay vote was because his mom told him to, which I find kind of cute that he was chastised by his mom into it. He was then, since he changed his mind last minute, was also accused of bribery. However, his mom going, "Come on, really? Let me vote," is far more likely of a story. Despite this being done before November, Georgia was one of the states that managed to delay the enactment of said rights until after that year's election. Partially due to this, Thomas W. Hardwick was elected to the governorship, but he foresaw a problem in the next election in which he planned on running for Senate. Women would be able to vote, and he had publicly spoken out against women's suffrage. But it's not like women are known for holding grudges. Oh wait, this might be a problem for him. The incumbent senator he would have been running against died on the 26th of September, 1922, and as governor, Thomas Hardwick had to appoint a temporary replacement to hold the seat until the next election, which was that November anyways. If only he could kill two birds with one stone. Then it hit him. On October 3rd, he decided the 87-year-old Rebecca Latimer Felton was the perfect appointee. The governor traveled to Bartow County and personally appointed Rebecca at the county courthouse. A crowd of women were in attendance, and they cheered as America now had a female senator. However, the Senate wasn't currently sitting and wouldn't be again until after the election scheduled for November 7th. But a lot of political wrangling could happen from now till then, starting with none other than General James Longstreet's widow, Helen Longstreet, personally petitioning Republican President Warren G. Harding on October 5th, asking him to declare a special session of Congress so Rebecca could be sworn in. Others soon followed, many of them reminding him that although it wasn't a presidential election year, they could weaken the Republican hold in the Senate. Harding refused to call a special session, literally just so his political opposition could get credit for the first female senator. I mean, come on now. Speaking of credit, it seems Georgia women didn't give Governor Hardwick credit, as he lost the Democratic primary on October 17th, losing to Judge Walter George, who would go on to win the general on November 7th. meaning the empty seat was now filled by a duly elected representative. 2 days later, however, Harding did declare that special session to begin November 20th. This would be a Republican-controlled Senate, but with a narrower margin, as the Democrats had gained 6 seats, bringing the total to 53 Republicans and 42 Democrats, alongside one member from the Minnesota Farmer Labor Party. The issue is that Rebecca would not be one of those senators. As I said, Walter George had been elected, but counting all the ballots takes time. And even after that, they would need to be certified. Now, Rebecca was 87 and had spent decades in both the political world and the fight for women's rights, which meant 2 things. 1, she didn't want to die without seeing her efforts bear fruit. Yes, she'd finally been able to vote, but how much sweeter would it be for her to actually officially hold power? And 2, she'd amassed some political favors, and now seemed like an ideal time to cash those babies in. And wouldn't you know it, Georgia's Secretary of State, S.G. McClendon, just so happened to be an ally of Rebecca. And he would declare it was unlikely the results of the election would be certified before the special session could start. I mean, after all, there were 14 counties where the count was just taking a while. And it looked like the state canvassing board would have to be called in to officially certify the election, and they could only be called in by governor's decree. But wouldn't you know it, the governor just so happened to be on vacation in New York. Oh well, looks like Rebecca's getting in. Except no, the governor cut his vacation short, returned, called the canvassing board, and they certified the election. But it wasn't over. Rebecca still had a card she could play. She literally just asked Walter George to delay in presenting his credentials. And Walter agreed. So he and Rebecca went to D.C. together, where, on November 20th, she entered the Senate and was welcomed by the other senators. She sat at an empty desk, and when the Senate was convened, they recognized her predecessor's death and then promptly adjourned. The next day, women filled the Senate gallery, where they gave Rebecca a standing ovation as she entered and took her place at her predecessor's empty desk. The Senate then convened, accepting the credentials of 2 new members before reaching Rebecca. At this point, Senator Thomas Walsh of Montana addressed the Senate, giving a short speech in which he said Rebecca was entitled to her seat. With no other senators objecting, the clerk accepted her credentials, and Vice President Calvin Coolidge swore her in. Senator Rebecca Felton then answered roll call and delivered a single speech where she said she looked forward to women being useful as senators in the future. She served a single day before the elected Senator, Walter George, took over. As she left the Senate, a crowd of women greeted her with applause, and Rebecca wept as there were no more worlds to conquer. In all seriousness, she retired to her home in Bartow County, where she could finally rest and write. On December 11th, 1925, her 4th child, Howard, died, meaning she outlived all her children. On April 19th, 1929, she was interviewed on film, which you can actually watch on YouTube. I'm going to link it down there. She published The Romantic Story of Georgia's Women in January of 1930, before she passed January 24th. Going from the Trail of Tears to the Great Depression, ending her life and ending this video while still technically Women's History Month. I snuck under the wire. I did it. Wait a minute, do I want footage of me in lipstick to be online forever?